and welcome back to Book and Page. We are finally on to Act 2 of Frogs. I almost said Act 2 of 2, which is true, but we're not quite to the end yet. We're just starting Act 2 here. And it turns out we are about to get into a battle of the bards, as it were. Yep. Oh, this is going to get fun. So as always, let's talk a little bit what happened in this first section of the scene, and then talk about things a little more deeply. This is going to be interesting because ultimately a lot of what's discussed here we don't have the context for, simply because we have ultimately lost a lot of plays by these playwrights. But let's do our summary first. So the scene starts out with Zan, who has been revealed to be the servant of Dionysus, and a slave of Pluto, which is to say Hades, cleaning the place up. They're doing menial tasks, talking with each other about how they like to grumble about their bosses, and eavesdrop, and listen in. And in fact, Hades' slave fills us in of what's been happening down in the underworld. It turns out the best of every art has a special seat at Hades' table for feasts. And this includes the best tragedian, writer of tragic plays. Aeschylus has been holding this seat, but Euripides showed up and started challenging him for it, mostly by getting all the rabble of the underworld to agree that he's the better playwright, and their statement is, it's a democracy, they have the right to choose who's best. Zan's kind of like, well, what about Sophocles? And apparently Sophocles came down and right away denounced his ability to have the seat, claiming that Aeschylus was better than him. But if Euripides wins, Sophocles has stated he'll challenge Euripides for the chair, but not Aeschylus. So, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to have a contest. And this includes weighing equipment. We'll do all the proper weighing of words, phrases, sentences, lines, and everything, just to see what's going on. Now, they were having a problem of trying to pick a judge, but now that Dionysus is here and he's the expert, he will be the judge. So, Zan and the slave disappear, Dionysus, Hades, and measuring equipment are brought out on stage, and then Aeschylus and Euripides also show up. We haven't started the contest yet, but man, are they just viciously going at each other. The main issue from the start seems to be Aeschylus acts too high and mighty, while Euripides does the opposite. He goes a little too lowbrow for his tragedies. Dionysus kind of tries to get in the middle of them and basically says, hey, why don't we actually properly start this thing? So he offers libations, the chorus offers a prayer to the muses, and then both Aeschylus and Euripides offer prayers to their own patron ideas. So then we get the contest properly beginning, and man. So Euripides is invited to go first, and he says, before I talk about myself, I want to talk about my opponent Aeschylus. So he does level certain charges against the man. First and foremost, that he uses cheap techniques to build suspense, and then uses highfalutin speeches to try and make it look like it paid off. But he's actually cheapening out, and the crowd gets nothing for it, because they can't understand anything he's talking about. Then Euripides kind of says, and I've learned. No, my characters are busy. You get action. They're busy from the beginning, no matter what type of position they are. And they have speeches that have taught the audience to think. He gets a little logic involved. The audience thinking thoughts now. Well, Aeschylus relied too much on silence, both for his characters and the audience. Aeschylus then comes in and basically says, okay, my turn, but I have a question for you, Euripides, which is, what makes a good playwright? What is the quality? And Euripides names two: technical ability and making the citizens better. Aeschylus then goes through a bunch of his plays, basically arguing that by Euripides' own named qualities, Aeschylus is a good playwright. His plays teach good moral lessons. Then the two of them kind of go at it, trying to prove that the other is actually teaching audience bad things. Yep. So I finished up for this video, but partway through this contest, where the chorus comes back in and basically says, oh, things are getting heated up here. Let's go again. I feel like the chorus has almost got that, like, round 1, round 2 sign. And they come on stage and they're like, bah, 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 bah. Round 2, go! Except it's a bunch of old Greek guys, and they definitely don't have a round 2 sign. Like I said, this is sort of hard to take a look at in the context of today because we don't have the context of when it was written. Which is to say that both of these playwrights reference multiple plays that are ultimately lost today. We know they existed because we have references like this, where information about them or names, characters, focuses show up in other works. Aristophanes often does this, he'll quote other things, but even different philosophers, Aristotle's The Poetics, mentions epics and comedies and tragedies that we don't have anymore. And this is true even into Roman times, like Marcus Aurelius mentions texts that from study were kind of like, we think it might be a forgotten text, like a lost text, because we can't find the exact thing. We just know at points they're quoted, and we can't find texts that these original quotations are coming from. So there are actually some jokes in here that don't perform well in today's audience simply because we don't have the context for them. Because there are characters mentioned, and you're just kind of like, I guess you had to have been there. And that can feel cheap to us, but at some points that's just how we're going to have to view certain aspects of a text, which is to say that this probably had a context we're simply not aware of and not able to understand here. And that can be really frustrating, but it's actually sort of a critical part of academic study, is allowing for non-understanding of certain things and not trying to force an understanding that's not there anymore. Like, it is perfectly fine for you to put a footnote, which this text does, and again, I love the Penguin Classics for their footnotes, because they're trying to put as much context into these as they can. But there are points where they've got a footnote that just says, like, this seems to be a joke. We don't know what it's joking about, but we're pretty sure it was a joke that the Greek audience would have understood. And you'll notice throughout this section that the audience is actually a player on the stage. And throughout this play, this has been true. There have been multiple points where the players on stage have looked back at the audience and acted like we're here, to the point where Dionysus has actually interacted directly with a high position in the Dionysian festival, asking for protection. But in this context of the contest, the audience is actually a really key part. And we're led into this belief by the fact that Zan and the slave reference the audience. But it's not exactly in a positive light, because we're the rabble who thinks that Euripides is good. We're the rabble that's been arguing that Euripides should have the seat for tragedy. And that's another contextual thing you have to keep in mind, which is that Aeschylus died before. So here, like, the critiques he has of Euripides here aren't his critiques. While Euripides' critiques of Aeschylus can be his own, we're actually getting Aristophanes' critiques of Euripides in the mouth of Aeschylus here. Which is just another thing you have to be aware of when studying things like this. And this happens with a lot of Greek characters. For example, Socrates. That might make us feel a little uncomfortable, but the sheer number of times people say this is what Socrates thought, you have to keep in mind you only see Socrates through the frame of Plato. Because Socrates doesn't write anything. Plato writes things and places Socrates as the central character of those writings. So you have to be really careful to try and suss out who is making what argument. Like, is this something that Socrates argued, or is this something that Plato argued using Socrates as a figure? And yes, sometimes those are very different, and sometimes Plato, it seems, doesn't always agree with what Socrates is saying, which is why he's using him as a character. Like, I might come across, like, really weird in saying this, but I am of the full belief that there are certain dialogues that Socrates does not win, because Plato is making a different argument than what Socrates was. Plato has learned from Socrates, and as always, the student eventually has to become the teacher. So I think there are points where Plato doesn't agree with Socrates and is using the dialogue to sort of show that. But it's hard to suss that out, and it takes years and years of study to really understand that. So always keep in mind with a video like this that we are looking at, like, very close to surface level, simply because we haven't had the time to sit down, read through all of Aristophanes, Aeschylus, and Euripides, because you need to understand all of them to start understanding the full arguments being made here, and who is arguing what. So, but most of us don't have time to do that, and most university classes are not going to have time to do that, because you could use an entire semester or an entire year just to study one text. You don't have time for that. So you've got to just keep aware of some of these weaknesses of your argument. For example, we don't know the full context of some of these jokes. We don't know the full context of Aristophanes versus Aeschylus argumentation here. So you've always got to be ready for somebody else to come in and be like, well, due to this other thing, this is why I perceive it differently. This video is much more about how to discuss texts without being assholes about it. Which I think is rather appropriate, because we're supposed to be then having this discussion between Euripides and Aeschylus, critiquing tragic plays. And we kind of have that happening, but man, do they get very heated. And that's, again, a difference between us and these characters. Of course they're going to feel heated, because this is not the Iliad or the Odyssey that they're debating over. It is their own works. And it's their babies, right? It's what they spent their life doing that the other is then tearing apart. So the anger there is understandable, and the cool-headedness is a benefit we have with the distance. It is not the benefit that they have, even if they're kind of being told, like, calm down, chillax. I'm like, no, no. You're being vicious to my work. I will not relax, and you can't make me relax. Of the many arguments end here, and again, in the many sections that we can't always suss out exactly what's happening, one thing I do want to talk about is the prayers that each of the playwrights offer. So, in starting the contest, Dionysus instructs the chorus to offer prayers to the Muses. And this is very common. The key thing to remember with the Greeks is it doesn't matter which god you're most associated with. If you are about to enter in a contest that focuses on another god, that's the god you pray to. For example, Odysseus is often, well, taken care of by Athena, but when he enters an archery contest, he understandably prays to Apollo. This is the proper thing to do. So the Muses here are invoked. Invocating the Muses asks for creativity and understanding to occur. It makes sense in a contest of poetry. But the additional prayers that Dionysus instructs the contestants to offer are very unique. So, Aeschylus, O Demeter, who do nourish my spirit, may I prove worthy of your mysteries. So here we get a very traditional prayer to a goddess that Aeschylus was invoked in the mysteries of. And it kind of makes sense. It might seem a little strange, but the Muses are sort of in charge of poetry. With them already invoked, you can then invoke your own personal gods. Demeter here, who nourishes my spirit, and of course, the body. She's the goddess of the harvest, grain, and the like. Then Euripides is offered incense by Dionysus, who then says, thank you but no, I pray to other gods. What special ones of your own? A private pantheon? Precisely. And Dionysus says, right then, pray to your personal gods. Dionysus says, right then, pray to your personal gods. And Euripides says, hail, ether, my sustainer, hail, hinge of tongue, hail, mind and sentient nostrils, inspire me with successful arguments. And here, then, we have the idea of a human-esque god, which is to say that what we humans have is enough. It's kind of like reason as God, but here it's also referring to his tongue, as in, I wish to speak well, and nostrils. I'm assuming that's more of a steady breathing while he speaks. So ultimately, we end up having a very traditional prayer versus a very strange one. Now, this can be looked at in a lot of different contexts. For example, looking back at the second scene of Act 1, the frogs and the mysteries being interposed on each other, which is to say, natural creativity versus a very structured state organized creativity, and Dionysus silences one and participates in the other. So we do kind of have that going on. Like, Aeschylus invokes the mysteries, while Euripides sort of invokes this more other natural, it's within me to speak well, write well, reason well, understand, and present a good play. The problem here, though, is precisely what we've been talking about earlier, which is to say, how do we know when Aristophanes is speaking versus Aeschylus or Euripides? Because this is actually a relatively well-known tactic of Aristophanes. He plays off the same tactic when he talks about Socrates in the clouds, which is to say hey, look at these people who think so highly of themselves they don't need the gods. Well, we don't have any proof that either Socrates or Euripides didn't celebrate the gods. And in fact, they probably did. It is rather common in Athens. What is being presented here is Aristophanes' view of a new age of thought that, while still probably worshipping the gods, also invokes human understanding. Euripides' full argument in a lot of what he says in this section is that he tries to get his audience to think about things. It is human thought that he is focusing on. So, in interposing these two and trying to make Euripides seem like somebody who dishonors the gods, Aristophanes is kind of skewing our perspective on it, which is a little unfair. And ultimately, this skewing does get Socrates killed. One of the major charges brought against him in court is that he doesn't give proper reverence to the gods. So Aristophanes here, he's punching low, and maybe a little unfairly. Euripides just wants us to think through some things. It's not really a bad thing. So let's finish this play up and see how the rest of the contest goes. So I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.